The Royal Lodge has long stood as Prince Andrew's last bastion of relevance, a historic symbol of status clutched tightly amid growing public disdain. But when King Charles made an unexpected decision behind palace doors, everything changed. What was once unshakable became uncertain, and what Andrew believed was protected turned into his ultimate humiliation. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Once the pride of Windsor, the Royal Lodge wasn't just a residence for Prince Andrew, it was a cornerstone of his royal identity, a reminder of favour bestowed by Queen Elizabeth herself. Despite growing scandals, shifting public opinion, and internal pressures to streamline the monarchy, Andrew clung to this estate with the weight of entitlement and desperation. To him, the Royal Lodge wasn't just a home, it was his last thread of legitimacy in a family that had grown colder with each passing year. But inside palace walls, change was coming, and not in whispers, but in directives. King Charles, burdened with restoring the monarchy's image in a new era, found Andrew's continued occupation of such a prominent estate increasingly untenable. For years, advisors had privately urged Charles to act, warning that any remaining association with Andrew would compromise broader efforts to modernize and cleanse the institution's tarnished image. And now, under immense pressure both externally and within, Charles finally decided to make a clean break. But the move wasn't just about removing Andrew, it was about replacing him. Enter Edward, the youngest and once quietest of the Queen's sons, who had spent his life avoiding headlines, controversies, and internal drama. In Edward, Charles saw not just a brother, but a loyalist who had upheld duty without demanding glory. And the Royal Lodge, long viewed as Andrew's final trophy, became a symbol of reward for NT service and steadfast loyalty. But what Andrew didn't know was that private meetings had already taken place in Balmoral meetings he was neither invited to nor informed of. Behind those locked doors, Charles laid out a plan, one supported quietly by Queen Camilla, to reassign the lodge entirely. The symbolism was deliberate. By shifting the estate from scandal to stability, Charles intended to send a message to the world. The monarchy would no longer protect the reckless. For Andrew, who still believed his past entitlements could not be revoked, this unseen betrayal would land with devastating force. And Camilla, though silent, had her reasons for supporting the move, reasons that hinted at deeper divides within the family. But while the public remained unaware, inside the palace walls, a storm of betrayal was gathering, one that would strike Andrew at his most vulnerable point. For decades, Prince Andrew and King Charles maintained a strained but unspoken agreement: brotherhood would trump betrayal. But as whispers turned into royal directives, Charles did the unthinkable. And this time, he didn't warn Andrew. He didn't need to. King Charles had long been burdened by the weight of legacy and reform. With the public demanding accountability, the monarchy's reputation constantly teetering, and international trust wearing thin, Charles faced a decision he could no longer delay. His brother's continued grip on the Royal Lodge had become a symbol of the past, a past that Charles was desperate to bury. The crown could not afford to be dragged backward by scandal, no matter how familial the ties. In hushed meetings at Clarence House, Charles laid bare his intentions to a select circle of aides. The language was careful but firm. "We must begin making difficult decisions for the crown's future," he said, eyes fixed on a document that would, in time, spark royal fire. Legal teams were quietly summoned. Confidential consultations were conducted, exploring the fine print of Prop. Leases, examining the very language Queen Elizabeth had once used to grant Andrew rights to the lodge, but sentimentality no longer had currency. This was business, strategic, inevitable. The monarch's lawyers crafted a new lease, one that would not include Andrew's name. Instead, a new name began to surface behind palace walls: Edward, the brother who had never caused a storm, the one who had walked the path of duty with his head bowed and his reputation intact. For many in Charles's inner circle, the choice wasn't just logical, it was overdue. The late Queen's unspoken wish to shield Andrew had faded with her passing. Whatever verbal assurances she may have offered were now void in a post-Elizabeth era. The Crown's direction had shifted, and behind Charles's determination stood Camilla. Quiet but unwavering. Her influence wasn't loud, but it was absolute. She had made it clear any association with Andrew would be a stain too deep to cleanse. She didn't push Charles, she simply reminded him of the stakes, of the image, of the future Catherine and William were to inherit. And Charles, ever aware of the ticking clock on his reign, acted. The moment was decisive and executed with spectacle. Edward wasn't consulted, not formally. He was informed. It wasn't an offer, it was an instruction. The lodge, long shrouded in privilege and controversy, would now be attached to the man who best represented a monarchy reborn. And just like that, the documents were signed, the deed done. The Royal Lodge had a new tenant on paper. The halls that echoed with Andrew's past were now destined to carry Edward's legacy. But the cruelty wasn't just in the decision, it was in the silence. Andrew wasn't told. Not directly, not honourably. He learned of the shift second-hand, a whisper from someone who had caught sight of a schedule change and entry that listed a property review under Edward's name. Disbelief quickly gave way to dread. What Charles had done was more than an eviction, it was an erasure. A final confirmation that Andrew was no longer a figure worth defending, no longer a brother worth protecting. And as the ink dried on a new lease agreement, the news hadn't yet reached Andrew, but a shocking visitor was about to deliver it. It wasn't a letter, it wasn't a call, it was a direct confrontation. When the truth reached Prince Andrew, it came not through discretion, but through brutal clarity, and it came from a source he never expected. That morning began like any other within the quiet walls of the Royal Lodge, but what unfolded within those gates would upend everything Andrew believed was still his. Royal staff, those once instructed to serve him unquestioningly, arrived not with deference, but with duty. In their hands, the formal notice of lease reassignment, stamped. With the seal of the Crown devoid of warmth, it spelled the beginning of Andrew's public unravelling. The document was final. It left no room for appeal, no margin for compromise. For a man who once wielded the privileges of royalty like armour, seeing his authority dissolved into ink, and paper felt like a slap echoing across every corridor of his isolated estate. The moment the words hit him, confusion gripped Andrew's face. It was not the reaction of a man prepared for defeat. It was disbelief, morphing swiftly into rage. His voice, once composed and commanding, broke as he demanded clarification, only to be met with silence. For years he had believed the Royal Lodge was untouchable, safeguarded by his mother's memory and his own assumptions of permanence. But now, standing in the very drawing room where he once hosted diplomats and dignitaries, Andrew was being told it was no longer his, and not by the monarch, not by Charles, but by staff bearing legal documents that left no doubt of intent. Longtime aides, some of whom had weathered his scandals and stood beside him through bitter storms, watched as he sank into a chair, repeating the same phrase with a vacant stare, "This can't be happening." The man who had once strode through royal grounds with unapologetic confidence now seemed diminished, lost in the echo of a decision he had never believed would come. But it had, and it came swiftly. Some say he wept, others say he screamed. What they all agreed on was the moment everything inside him cracked. In the aftermath, conflicting narratives emerged. Andrew insisted this betrayal, a personal slight masked as royal protocol. But palace insiders rebutted swiftly this was policy, a long-delayed decision grounded in strategic necessity. They insisted Charles had acted with the Crown's best interests in mind. Yet, conspicuously absent in that moment was Prince Edward, the brother set to inherit the very estate being taken from Andrew. His absence only deepened the woe. Allowing speculation to fester unchecked. Was it cowardice, mercy, or a deliberate maneuver to avoid confrontation? The story didn't stay contained within the lodge's high walls for long. Whispers reached the tabloids by evening. reporters began circling Windsor, sensing blood in the water. Phrases like displaced prince and Royal Lodge coup flooded social media, fueling questions the palace. CE refused to answer. But what Andrew didn't realize was that this was more than a property reassignment. This was a calculated move in a larger royal chess match. While Andrew faced the crumbling of his last hold on royal privilege, Edward was being prepared for a role far greater than anyone anticipated. Not through spectacle, but through quiet trust, and Charles had made his choice. For years, Edward had remained in the shadow of louder, more scandal-laden figures within the family. He was the dutiful brother, the one who didn't chase headlines or play power games. But behind that quiet presence lay something King Charles had come to value above all else: loyalty. Not blind, but consistent. It was Edward's unwavering commitment to duty that stood in stark contrast to the turbulence surrounding Andrew, and it was this stark contrast that solidified Charles's decision. The moment demanded a figure who could embody the future of the monarchy without dragging the ghosts of its past behind him. And so, in private meetings closed off even from senior courtiers, Charles laid out a new expectation. Edward was no longer just a supporting royal. He was to become a keeper of legacy. ID's confidential conversations. The Royal Lodge was framed not just as a residence, but as a symbol of trust, a place that needed to be protected from scandal, restored to quiet nobility. Charles saw in Edward a man who would not only care for the property, but would respect its history and carry it into the next era with honor. These weren't honors gifted lightly, they were positions with meaning. And Edward, despite his humility, understood exactly what was being asked of him. This wasn't about convenience or real estate. It was about inheritance of responsibility, of image, of institutional resilience. Behind closed doors, Sophie, Countess of Wessex, played her role with quiet grace. She encouraged Edward, not with pressure, but with purpose. She reminded him that legacy didn't wait for permission. That this moment had arrived not by chance, but by years of steadfast service and silence during storms not of his making. She understood what this shift would mean, not just to Edward, but to the very heartbeat of the monarchy. The lodge was more than walls. It was memory, continuity, and control. And yet, for all the strategic planning, Edward could not ignore the discomfort that followed him like a shadow. His bond with Andrew, while never close, was still rooted in shared history. Now he was stepping into a role that would symbolize Andrew's total fall from royal grace. There was no gloating in Edward's acceptance, only unease. The fear that this appointment, however justified, would become a wedge too great to ignore. But the decision had been made. Charles's seal had been on-stamped, and Edward, as always, obeyed with dignity. As the days passed and preparations began behind the scenes, Edward's title was quietly updated in royal records. The lodge, now attached to his name, was being repositioned not just physically, but politically. He was to be not only its inhabitant, but its guardian, a role that went beyond occupancy. It was about protecting heritage from the contamination of scandal. He moved forward as instructed, even as the whispers of unrest at Windsor grew louder. But while Edward tried to maintain dignity in his rise, Andrew was preparing a counterattack, one driven by desperation and fury, in a last-ditch effort to reverse what he called a dishonorable injustice. Prince Andrew composed a letter that would never reach the public until now, with, in its pages, guilt, grievance, and one devastating admission. Penned in hurried strokes and riddled with the desperation of a man watching his world collapse, the letter was not just a plea, it was a final performance of entitlement dressed as wounded dignity, addressed to King Charles, but written with an audience of memory and sentiment in mind. Andrew implored his brother to reconsider. He didn't speak as a disgraced royal. He spoke as a child of Windsor, invoking the image of their mother, Queen Elizabeth II, as his shield. With trembling certainty, he insisted the Royal Lodge had been promised to him for life. That this decision, now seemingly etched in cold legal language, was a betrayal not only of him, but of the Queen's will and unspoken but sacred trust. But woven between the lines of sorrow was something darker, a veiled warning, hints that if pushed further, he might be compelled to speak. About what he did not say directly, but the implication hung heavy, that not all secrets should be tested. It was a subtle form of defiance, cloaked not in rage, but in regretful caution. He wrote of loyalty, of sacrifices made, of the nights spent defending the crown's silence when scandal loomed. He reminded Charles of their shared childhood, of moments lost behind palace walls when titles mattered less than blood. And still, beneath the sorrow, there was an undeniable tension. Andrew wasn't just bedgy, he was bargaining. When Charles received the letter, he read it in silence. Those close to him say his face did not change. There was no flicker of hesitation, no sign of emotional recoil. Only a single sentence was spoken aloud after the final line, "The crown must come first." That was the only reply Andrew ever received. The letter was placed into a sealed folder, marked confidential, and awed with other royal correspondence deemed too dangerous to destroy, but too inflammatory to acknowledge. Camilla, however, did read it, and her reaction was less reserved. Her response, delivered in a tone of calm finality, was one of quiet outrage. To her, the letter reeked of manipulation. She viewed Andrew's plea not as a cry for unity, but as a threat cloaked in nostalgia. Her recommendation to Charles was blunt. Let it be known that his appeals have no weight. The message was clear: there would be no path back, not through sentiment, not through secrecy. And yet, the palace's carefully constructed silence was already crumbling. Too many had seen the letter, too many knew it existed, and in a court where every whisper carries weight, secrecy becomes its own form of spectacle. But why? Andrew sought pity. Palace insiders were already preparing the public narrative, and a leak was inevitable. The letter was never meant to be seen. But someone inside the palace had other plans. When the press got their hands on Andrew's secret words, the headlines ignited, and the monarchy's inner fractures burst into public view. It began with whispers. Rumors passed between editors and royal company. Respondents, a tip from a source too close to the truth to be ignored. And then, without warning, it hit the front page. Andrew's private plea to King Charles, once tucked away in royal files and wrapped in confidentiality, was now dissected line by line by the global media. The tone, the threats, the desperate clinging to maternal promises, it was all there, exposed in its rawest form. For Andrew, it was a devastating breach. For the monarchy, it was an earthquake. The fallout was immediate and unforgiving. Public response was brutal. Sympathy existed, but it was drowned in a tidal wave of mockery. Phrases like delusional, tone-deaf, and a relic begging for relevance trended across every platform. The letter, intended as a cry for restoration, became a symbol of royal arrogance laid bare. Every sentence he wrote now stood as public evidence of a prince, still trapped in a world the crown was trying to leave behind. Inside the palace, the atmosphere turned frigid. Camilla's fury was unmistakable. She didn't speak publicly, but her message to Charles behind closed doors was pointed and sharp. She suspected a leak not from their side, but from someone still loyal to Andrew. A aide, a bitter sympathizer, or perhaps Andrew himself in a desperate gamble for public support. Regardless of who, the betrayal was complete. And for a royal institution that thrives on controlled narratives, this rupture was a violation of the highest order. Charles, as always, remained silent. He offered no comment, no denial, no outrage. But his silence echoed louder than any royal statement. It was the silence of finality, the confirmation that reconciliation was no longer on the table. And then came the unexpected consequence: Edward. Until now, he had been sheltered from the chaos, protected by the quiet dignity that defined his role. But with Andrew's letter dominating headlines and Edward's name tethered to the Royal Lodge transition, the spotlight could no longer be avoided. Porters camped outside his appearances, hurling questions he had no intention of answering. Was he complicit in his brother's exile? Had he lobbied for the lodge? Was he the silent beneficiary of Andrew's downfall? He deflected, remained composed, but the pressure was mounting. The Crown's strategy had been precision, but now it was improvisation. The leak not only inflamed public opinion, IT Expo said the raw, unresolved wounds within the family. Trust was eroded, lines were drawn, and while the public devoured the scandal, the palace scrambled to prevent more cracks from showing. But the damage wasn't limited to headlines. The real fracture was within the family itself, and the consequences would ripple into future generations. As the storm escalated, two royal brothers, each estranged in different ways, found themselves strangely aligned in judgment. What Prince William and Prince Harry reportedly said about Andrew's downfall left even palace aides stunned. For once, the distance between Kensington and Montecito didn't matter. From two vastly different corners of the royal sphere, William and Harry, so often divided by pain and perspective, had reached the same conclusion. Prince William, whose loyalty to duty has shaped his every public stance, was blunt in private. According to insiders close to the palace, he called the decision to reassign the Royal Lodge long overdue. There was no hesitation, no pity. For William, this wasn't merely about property, it was about drawing a final line between honour and disgrace. In his view, the monarchy could not carry forward the weight of those who continually pulled it backward. From across the ocean, Prince Harry's reaction, though quieter, echoed the same sentiment. Consequences come for everyone, he reportedly remarked to a close friend. It was a short statement, simple, but laced with gravity. Though estranged from the institution, Harry understood better than most how unforgiving the royal machine could be. And despite his own battles with the crown, he did not extend sympathy to Andrew. The silence from both brothers grew louder than any defense Andrew could mount. It wasn't just a famine closing ranks. It was a generational rejection. Inside the royal family, Andrew's world continued to shrink. Any remnants of support he may have once relied upon began to vanish, replaced with a chilling distance. The nephews he once believed might stand with him in solidarity had effectively endorsed his exile. Their judgment stung more than any public scandal ever had. It wasn't just betrayal, it was abandonment, and the deeper cut came from the language they all used. Each of them invoked the Queen's legacy. Some claimed she would have supported Charles's decision. Others insisted she would have defended Andrew. Her memory, once a unifying force, had become a contested battleground. Caught in the emotional crossfire were Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, both struggling to shield our father, while maintaining fragile ties to the rest of the family. Their loyalty to Andrew was never in doubt, but their position within the institution made neutrality impossible. Every move they made was scrutinized, every silence interpreted as complicity or resistance. Friends close to the sisters said they were heartbroken, torn between familial love and a royal order that demanded distance. All the while, Andrew's sense of betrayal deepened, his connections eroding by the day. What was once a network of privilege had turned into a prison of isolation. Andrew no longer found refuge in his bloodline, and the family that once protected him now stood divided in judgment. But amid the silence, a storm was still brewing, because just when Andrew believed he had lost everything, a figure from the past resurfaced with one final message, sealed and unsigned. Long buried in the archives of Windsor, a handwritten note from the late Queen Elizabeth surfaced at the worst possible moment. And what it said left everyone, including Charles, speechless. Was this her true wish all along? The discovery came not through design, but by accident. An archivist, reviewing correspondence for a separate historical exhibition, stumbled across a folded piece of personal stationery, neatly tucked behind a leather-bound folder marked Private Royal Considerations. It was unmistakably the Queen's handwriting, meticulous, measured, and undeniably personal. The note wasn't long, but its contents carried the weight of legacy. In it, Queen Elizabeth made reference to the Royal Lodge, and, with careful raising, acknowledged that should circumstances demand a change, she hoped Edward would be the one to take stewardship of the property. It wasn't a command, It wasn't a decree, but it was there, in her hand, penned with foresight and a sense of inevitability. Palace aides were immediately divided. Some argued it meant everything that the Queen had quietly planned for Edward's succession at the loggia, even as she allowed Andrew to reside there. Others viewed it differently, believing it was nothing more than a hypothetical musing written during a time when Andrew's future still seemed salvageable. But in a palace where every word can shape generations, ambiguity was as dangerous as certainty. Charles, upon reading it, reportedly went silent. For a man who had spent months battling the emotional weight of evicting his own brother, the letter struck a deeply personal chord. But despite the clear emotion, he did not waver. The decision stands, he is said to have told his closest advisor. The past, even one written in his mother's hand, would not reverse what he had already set in motion. The note was shown only to a select few. One of them was Edward. When he read it, witnesses described him as visibly moved, almost shaken. For a man known for his composure, the impact was clear. He hadn't asked for this inheritance. He hadn't lobbied for it. But now, the Queen's own words had affirmed what had quietly been decided in his name. The emotional burden of taking over the lodge now carried a spiritual weight, one bestowed not by the crown, but by the matriarch who had shaped them. And in that moment, any doubt he carried was replaced by something heavier: responsibility. But Andrew, upon learning of the note's existence, demanded to see it. He was denied. Palace officials, citing privacy and the Queen's original intent to keep the message personal, refused to share the contents. That denial was salt in a wound still bleeding. Andrew believed he had lost everything but he was being denied the chance to read what might have been his mother's final thoughts on the very estate that had defined his last shred of identity. To him, it wasn't just secrecy, it was erasure, a quiet rewriting of royal history with him scrubbed from the margins. And as the curtain falls on this painful chapter, the message is clear: legacy is earned, not inherited. But for Andrew, humiliation was only the beginning. With the royal lodge slipping from his grasp and royal favour beyond reach, Prince Andrew faces a bleak future. Stripped of symbolic power and isolated from family, his world has changed forever. But will he fade into quiet exile or fight back once more? The pressure to vacate became undeniable. Legal advisors, once deferential, were now precise, firm. Under the specific clauses of the lease crafted during a time when trust in Andrew still held weight, there remained conditions that, if violated, could be used to force him out. And now the palace was invoking them, quietly, ruthlessly. He had weeks, not months. The writing wasn't just on the wall, it was stamped in official royal paperwork. For the first time, Andrew realized there was no one left to shield him. No monarch, no institution, no protection. Behind the scenes, aides discussed the possibility of offering Andrew a secondary property, one with far less prestige and visibility. A symbolic gesture to soften the blow and avoid the optics of total displacement. But Andrew saw through the suggestion immediately. It wasn't a compromise, it was a burial, a banishment masked in courtesy. And for a man who had once walked among the most powerful in the world, the offer felt like exile. Worse, it felt like confirmation that he was no longer one of them. The whispers began again, this time louder. Was Andrew preparing to leave the country altogether? Was he seeking new alliances, perhaps among foreign royals or former confidants who still owed him favors? Some claimed he was toying with the idea of publishing a memoir not as retaliation, but as vindication. An attempt to reclaim his voice, rewrite his place in history, and challenge the narrative that had slowly erased him. The palace, alarmed by the potential fallout, began monitoring his movements more closely, wary of any step that could fracture the already fragile equilibrium. And while the eyes of the media remained fixated on him, Edward quietly moved forward. The transfer of the royal lodge was deliberately muted. No photographs, no grand announcements, only a small private moment in which Edward assumed control of the estate. It was the final act in a long, calculated transition, a confirmation that the monarchy had not only turned the page, but closed the chapter. Edward, dignified and steady, did not celebrate. He understood the weight of what had been done. As for Andrew, the final image was haunting. He stood alone, no staff, no escort, watching as the gates of the royal lodge closed behind him for the last time. It wasn't just the end of his residency, it was the end of his era. Once a prince of promise, now a symbol of what the crown could no longer afford to carry. The silence from the palace was deafening. No statements, no acknowledgements, just the quiet, methodical removal of a name from a door. In the battle for power, titles and memory, the crown has spoken. And its silence toward Andrew now says more than words ever could. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.